has an expiration date. The food we buy, even Twinkies, medication, skincare products, coupons, and even some contracts have an expiration date. Today, we're going to look at faith without an expiration date. Hebrews 11:11 through 12 says, by faith, Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So I'm continuing the series that Glenn's been preaching on living the faith. And this series challenges us to do what we say we believe, to practice faith. It's one thing to say we believe in God, that he is who he says he is. It's one thing to say that we believe he is our provider and he is our healer and all the other names of God. But it's another thing to live like we believe it. Our key verse, Hebrews 11:6, and without faith it is impossible to please God. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. In each of the scriptures that we've studied so far, we see people who believed what God said and believed for the impossible. The enemy sometimes messes with our minds and puts fear and doubt in our thoughts. We may become discouraged and be tempted to just give up. We have a choice whether we continue to listen to the lies of the enemy or we fight the good fight of faith. We've got to fight the good fight of faith and renew our hearts to believe what God said he will do. We see Sarah, a woman who was barren and is now past childbearing years. The natural world would say, and the devil would say, it is too late for you. You're too old. You've lived your life. You just need to settle down and enjoy your retirement years. But it's not too late. And if there is a lesson here today, it is that God is never late. It was God's will to show his power through the impossible. When Abram was 75 years old, God promised that he would make him into a great nation. And we read in Genesis 12, verses 2 to 4. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Put yourself in Abram's sandals. When would you expect this promise to be fulfilled? He's 75 years old. You would probably think, oh, God's promised me a son. Yeah, next year we'll have a son and everything will be great. That's what we would expect. But that's not what happened. Move forward 10 years. Abram's now 85 years old. And again, God promises him that his seed will become a great nation. And we read in Genesis 15, 1 through 5. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. So God speaks to Abram in a vision. And Abram immediately tells God he has not fulfilled his promise yet, and that the arrangements have been made that to give all he has to his chief servant. There are two kinds of faith. The first kind of faith waits patiently. The second challenges God to keep his word, to keep his promise. Both look to God as one who's able to do what he says he will do. We have faith, but sometimes we get impatient and try to help God out. Genesis 16, 1 through 4. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then we go down to verse 15. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So 11 years after God promised him a son, Sarai and Abram get impatient and try to help God out. Sarah decided that since she hadn't had a child in 11 years after God made the promise, that she would give her servant Hagar to Abram so that she could have a child through her. Now, I wouldn't have come up with this plan because I don't share my husband or my chocolate. Glenn thinks that's funny because he knows it's true. Can we receive the promises of God by following our own plans? Can we work out the will of God by trying to make things happen in our timetable and in our way? We can't. Ishmael has come to represent the law and man's attempt to have a relationship with God through human efforts. After Ishmael's birth, what did God say to Abram that revived his faith in the promise that God gave him? We read in Genesis 17, 15 to 21, where God again came to Abram and made the promise again. Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarai your wife, you shall call her name shall not be called Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. We've read in the scripture 3 times that God promised Abraham a son who would become a great nation, as numerous as the stars. Up to this point, God has spoken only to Abraham, even though the promise was for Abraham and Sarah to have a son. Sarah had heard it secondhand from Abraham. Then in chapter 18, we see that Sarah hears the word of the Lord for herself. In Genesis 18, 9-14. Then they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, there in the tent. He said, I will surely return to you at I will surely return to you at this time next year. And behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah laughed. It was so hard to believe that this could actually happen, and it was so improbable it was funny. This time, Sarah heard the promise for herself. This time next year, you will have a son. The Lord said, at the appointed time. The Lord had already appointed the time. Through all the questions they had, the impatience that led to the birth of Ishmael, God had an appointed time to fulfill the promise. God had an appointed time when Jesus was born. We read in Galatians 4:4, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. How much more patient would we be? How much less would we strive to make things happen if we believe that God has an appointed time to fulfill his promise? He had an appointed time. He already decided the time. Sometimes God doesn't do things in our timing, and we get impatient like Abraham and Sarah did. How many years had passed without God fulfilling this promise to Abraham and Sarah? 25 years. By this time, it was definitely a laughing matter. Because when the messenger arrives and tells them this time next year you'll have a son, Sarah was 90. Can an older woman give birth to a baby? Not in human strength, no. But she can when God enables her. Did Elizabeth give birth to John the Baptist even though she was older? Yes. God fulfilled the promise that he made to Zechariah and Elizabeth, just as the angel had said. Can God do the impossible? When the devil says it can't be done, God can. When we're tempted to say it's impossible, we have to look at these people of faith and realize that they were human just like we are. Did they make mistakes? Oh, yeah. We see a lot of mistakes. You know, I'm glad that when the Holy Spirit anointed this word, that they didn't leave out all the shortcomings of everyone. What would we do if we just had the promise of God and then Abraham and Sarah had a baby? What would we learn from that? How would we grow in our faith? That's what waiting is. When we have to wait for a promise, it strengthens our faith to believe for the impossible. Because the longer the time goes between the promise and the fulfillment, the more we're tempted to give up. And that's when we have to go to the Lord and be strengthened in our faith. But when God got involved, everything changed. Too often we listen to the thoughts and the words that this is impossible, when God says all things are possible. Can God use two people who seem to be past childbearing years? Yes. So what this tells me is that we don't have the option to tell God what he can and can't do. God can do all things. You know, we say we believe that. We say we believe that God spoke the world into existence and that everything that we see was created by God. But do we live like we believe it? Do we live like there's nothing that impossible with God? You may have been praying about something that God has placed in your heart, and you've not seen it come to pass. Believe God. Put your faith in him to fulfill what he promised, because he who promised is faithful. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. There was a lady named Catherine, prayer warrior, at one of the churches we pastored, and she would go down to the altar and pray, and she would get up and she'd say, it's a done deal. Because to her, when she prayed about it, it was done. Because she had faith to believe that when God told her that it was going to be done, that it was going to be done. And she was definitely a woman of faith. Pray and believe what God said he will do. Have you been praying for years for a loved one to be saved? Keep praying. Have you been praying for healing, but it hasn't quite come yet? Keep praying. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Spiritual victory comes with a price. It'll cost our time. It'll cost commitment. It'll cost resources. What if Abraham refused to leave home? What if David ran from Goliath? What if Joseph never shared his dreams? What if Daniel stopped praying when he got to Babylon? We do have a choice today to look through eyes of faith and move forward and receive the promise, or stay where we are. Abraham and Sarah received Isaac, the son of promise, after 25 years because their faith didn't have an expiration date. Joseph's dreams became a reality, and he was second in command in Egypt after waiting 13 years because his faith didn't have an expiration date. David became king after waiting 15 years because his faith didn't have an expiration date. The children of Israel entered the promised land because their faith didn't have an expiration date. What has God promised you? Have you read in the Word and seen a promise and you said, I know that's for me? Or maybe you felt God speak to you and God made you a personal promise. Maybe promised you that your loved one would be saved, or promised you that you would be healed, or some other promise. Don't give up. Keep believing. What have you been waiting for? Believing for by faith. Does your faith have an expiration date? Does anyone need prayer today? Anyone want to come up and pray and say, God, I've been kind of discouraged lately, but my faith doesn't have an expiration date. And I'm going to believe you because you promised me.